Welcome to our talk today. I'd like to share the Yale University Land Acknowledgement with everyone to welcome you to our presentation today. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. I'm so happy to see everyone online with us today. We have a great program for you this afternoon. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Megan Sullivan. I'm a PhD candidate at the Yale School of the Environment, and I'm the Research Spotlight Assistant for the Peabody Museum. This is our Research Spotlight series, and this is the Peabody's Graduate Student Speaker Series. We spotlight different graduate students who do their research in connection with the museum's collections. Just a few technical items before we start our presentation today. We have disabled the chat function for this webinar, so please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. And you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. We typically receive many more questions than our presenters have time to answer, so we apologize in advance if our speaker is not able to get to your questions today. And finally, our program is being live captioned. So you can turn on the captioning in the menu, which is usually at the bottom right of your Zoom window. Today we have Paul Burow speaking for us. Paul is a sixth-year PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology and forestry and environmental science at Yale. And Paul's work examines the cultural dynamics of environmental change, rural social inequality, and Indigenous environmental justice across North America. Paul draws upon a decade of place-based work collaborating with Indigenous nations, land management agencies, and conservation organizations across the Western US. His talk today will focus on cultural values and environmental change in North America's Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. And with that, I will pass it off to Paul.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Peabody Museum for inviting me here to speak today. Special thanks going out to Megan Sullivan, David Heiser, also Jesse and Chris and other staff at the museum who made this talk possible. I am joining you today from the Great Basin. I live in Nevada near Lake Tahoe, and I wanted to start by acknowledging colleagues I work with here and also the lands that I am on, the homelands of the Numu or Paiute nations and the Washoe or Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. Today, I will be sharing some of my dissertation research, something I've been working on for the last nearly 7 years on the cultural dynamics of environmental change in Western North America. The Great Basin is a region of North America defined variously for its status as a set of contiguous endorheic watersheds. That is, waters with no outlet to the sea, a cold desert environment at relatively high elevation, mostly above 4,000 feet, and characterized by floral communities such as sagebrush steppe, pinyon-juniper woodlands, and even alpine environments. And this is really only a small subset that I'll be talking about today. These different environments are very much linked to the climate of the region, which is continental in nature with hot, dry summers and cold, snowy winters. Most of the moisture falls as snow during the winter months and melts out during the spring and early summer. There is some influence from the North American monsoon in the Great Basin, but in a gradient that lessens as you move from southeast to northwest. The region's also often characterized by its geology, the Basin and Range province that stretches from the area of southern Oregon and Idaho down into Mexico. In Nevada, the Basin Range is composed of alternating north-south oriented mountain ranges and valleys spanning hundreds of miles. So here I wanted to include just a few photos illustrating the environmental diversity of the region, but again, note that there are many other ecosystem types here. I'll be talking about Pinyon-Juniper woodlands pictured here, but also a sagebrush steppe is an incredibly important part of the landscape, and there are also alpine environments, alkali flats, and so forth. There's also another sense of the Great Basin beyond the biophysical that I want to talk about, and that's the sociocultural and political context of the region. This region's home to many indigenous nations and peoples, the Numu, the Niue, Washu, the Wuvi peoples who have called these lands home for millennia. Or what they often describe as time immemorial. And so this map here, I'm showing Numu ancestral lands in the Western Great Basin, will give you a little bit of a sense of where we are. So here's Lake Tahoe right here, and I'll be talking about forests in this borderland region between California and Nevada. I came to the Great Basin as both an insider and an outsider. I grew up in Northern California and was introduced to the region by my parents, who are both geologists. And Nevada, as many of you may know, is a geological paradise. I returned to the area during graduate school while training as an anthropologist and ethnoecologist to look at how human communities are connected to landscapes and are being impacted by a changing environment. Understanding these relationships are important for navigating climate and land use change with this important implications for lifeways, livelihoods, and environmental justice in the United States. The questions that emerged from my preliminary fieldwork were driven by what community members thought needed careful attention. Indigenous nations who valued pinyon trees and worried about their fate with climate change. Concerns about drought-induced mortality, landscape scale, stand replacing wildfire, and also clear-cutting projects on public lands. I also heard from many land management agencies and their staff, such as the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, about the thorny challenges they're facing around protecting threatened species like sage grouse, dealing with wildfire, and also the impacts of invasive species such as cheatgrass. And finally, though, I say little about it today because of time constraints. I also work with ranchers who graze livestock on public lands in the region. This is an important community in the area, and this is a group of people who are seeking to also sustain their own way of life and livelihoods among these environmental changes, and also changing values among the broader public about the uses of federal lands. I get at these research questions through ethnography, which is a research methodology commonly used in the social sciences. Ethnography is a way to get at the everyday life of a place. It illuminates the social practices and beliefs core to a group of people's identity by participating in the daily life of that community. I work across 3 communities: Numu people, federal land agencies, and ranchers, because the issues I'm looking at sit at the intersection of different ways of knowing and valuing the landscape. I want to open with the story from my fieldwork to set the stage for a discussion of these issues. Here I am. Imagine this is your vantage from where I'm standing. I'm standing in Pahabipa'a, or Sweetwater, with Thomas. I use pseudonyms throughout this presentation. Thomas is an official with the nearby Paiute Nation. We are looking at what was once an intact forest. Quote, "All this cutting for hope," unquote. He says, "They're trying to offer the bird better habitat. All around us, pinyon trees lay cut up and laid to waste under the hot Nevada sun." He continues, "They say these trees don't have any value. They are no good for timber, but to us, they are of great value." Here, Thomas is referencing the relationship that Numu people maintain with pine nut trees, commonly used term in the area, but that refers to pinyon, and highlights an importance to indigenous peoples. So what is this pinyon pine and why are they so important? So I want to zoom out for a moment. Pinyon pines are a group of related tree species that span an axis of nearly 3,000 kilometers from Puebla, south of Mexico City, all the way up to Idaho in the United States. Pinyon-Juniper woodlands are a widespread forest type found across 100 million acres of the western United States. That's an area roughly the size of California, which is the 3rd largest state in the nation. Notice here the expansive range. of these related tree species. And over time, they've been moving north. The trees near Reno, Nevada are dated to only a few hundred years here, at least in its northwest corner of its range. But then further south in Southern California, they've been around for thousands of years. And so this map, just to explain it a little bit, we're interested in this group here, Symporites, and you could see that they're really covering a very expansive landscape. I'm going to talk mainly about single leaf pinyon, Pinus monophylla, which is found throughout Nevada and then a little bit in Utah and Arizona. And this single leaf pinyon is unique for having only one needle. It's the only pine with one needle, and is very much adapted to the climate and moisture cycle that you see in the Great Basin. Pinyon pines are perhaps best known for pinyon, the large edible seeds produced by the trees. While all pines are seed producers and pine nuts are a staple traditional food source across the world, pinyons are notable for being prolific producers that sustain a whole constellation of life in arid and semi-arid regions of North America. For a long time, pine nut trees have sat at the center of indigenous worlds in the Southwest. They give life to the entire landscape. They provide food for people, for birds, for animals, and the world began and ended among its crowns of pale green. So how did such a being as this become a weedy pest in need of removal? Dryland forests are examples of anthropogenic landscapes. Not only is there a deep history of indigenous ecological practices shaping the landscape, but there are more recent phenomena such as livestock grazing, fire suppression, and the arrival of invasive species that are leaving an indelible imprint on the land. This is leading some to ask if we're approaching a tipping point where native ecosystems are transformed into novel ecosystems or new configurations of plants and animals that function very differently than past ecosystems. I would argue that we are already partway there, but the implications are not yet entirely clear, although we're certainly seeing this perhaps most prominently in the case of catastrophic wildfire. The future of North America's Pinyon-Juniper woodlands is one example of the challenges of these environmental changes. And here in the photo, I wanted to show some images of other woodland obligate species. So there are lots of animals that really depend upon Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, throughout the course of their life. Perhaps most famously, the pinyon jay that has seen substantial declines across the range. And then there are a lot of other animals that use the woodlands, perhaps not for their entire life cycle, but intermittently. It's an important food source for black bears that have been expanding, reestablishing their range, especially interior ranges in Nevada. It's often eaten by mule deer and other passing species. When thinking about the moral relations of the forest, the question of value looms large. This is true in the Great Basin, where contrasting views of forest history collide over the management and care of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. Value is reflected in the assessment of the intrinsic worth of something. It plays an important role in mediating human perception of landscapes and the forms of life present on them. And it shapes the modes of human action deemed appropriate to the land, with its consequent effects on the ever-changing community of life present on these landscapes. Far from a passive backdrop to human action, the plants and animals that animate a landscape are responding to influences from climatic change, wildfire suppression, and the appearance of new species. Their presence is tied up in the social identities and cultural practices of people who call this place home. Here in the photo, just to point it out, is a single leaf pinyon masting. So there's an irregular cycle of cone production. This happened to be from 2019, which was a very good year. The last 2 years have been very bad for pine nut collecting, but you could just see, the masting trees have all of these bursting cones. And this is probably only a few months before they would ripen and could be picked not long after this photo was taken. And this normally takes place in the fall. Going back to the landscape where I was standing with Thomas, cleared of trees, he brought up a bird. And the bird that Thomas was mentioning was the sage grouse, an animal whose range once blanketed the western United States, but is in grave decline. To arrest this decline, land management agencies have focused on cutting projects to recreate sagebrush habitat for grouse. Paiute people share concern about the fate of sage grouse. It's an important animal in their culture, but they question the need for decimating forests to do it. The act of removing trees severs the important relationship between people and trees, one predicated on responsibilities to provide for one another. Forests are sites of moral relations among people, plants, and animals, and the hierarchical regimes of value at play in public lands policy shape these tensions across different communities and institutions over what is perceived as belonging on the land, especially during this moment of change. As David, a Numu elder, remarks, the forests don't wait, it's changing all the time. And indeed, the long wait carries risks. The Numu connection to place is deeply felt. It is not uncommon to meet people who were born in this area on local ranches that hired native employees or whose families are buried on these lands. Sweetwater, which I introduced near the beginning and was on the photo, the first slide, was once an important place of residence for Numu people because of its abundance of pine nut trees. Today, few people live out in Sweetwater, just a few ranch houses along the road, and many Numu people live in nearby communities such as Bridgeport or Urington, small towns where these Paiute nations have their own small land bases and space for housing and community. And the map you're seeing here is showing the Walker River watershed, stretching from the crest of the Sierra Nevada here and flowing all the way down into its terminus in Walker Lake. And so forests cover much of the uplands in this landscape. An illustration of the risks is what happened last summer. In 2021, the Tamarack fire ripped through 80,000 acres in only a matter of days. It wiped out nearly all of the pine nut trees in Alpine County, including thousands of acres on lands of the Washoe tribe. The sense of urgency has increased over time as the drought endures, the southwestern mega drought that you may have read about in newspaper stories, and more lands convert into a sea of cheatgrass that burns more frequently and carries fire into areas that had not previously seen it in over a century. The risk is real. The Paiute Nation at Bridgeport is at one of the highest risk areas for wildfire of any tribal nation in the United States. And the area around Sweetwater is the largest Pinyon-Juniper forest stand in the entire Eastern Sierra, a place that Indigenous people come to visit and collect pine nuts from hundreds of miles away. Thinking a little bit more about this question of value, you might think about language, and I can't help myself, being an anthropologist and understanding how important language is for thinking about culture. So language offers an indication of value because it incorporates that which is most important. So, for example, something that's notable about pine nut trees, of course, is the nut, the food that it provides. Tubapi is the Paiute term for pinyon pine. Tuba being the root that refers to the pine nut. This explains the common Numu anglicization of pinyon pine as pine nut tree. And in fact, a lot of the earlier accounts, even in forest documents, refer to it as nut pine. Compare this to another common pine in the area, Jeffrey pine, which is known as Pabiu tubapi, which is translated as big pine nut tree. Jeffrey pines also have large cones with pine nuts, but they're covered in thorny scales and have small winged seeds that are a little bit less desirable to collect as the very large seeds found in pinyon cones. The trees are indeed much larger than pinyon pine, growing several times taller, and are found often in wetter, high elevation sites closer to the Sierra Nevada crest. And here some of the common pine netting implements. You have a ladder to get up higher into the tree. You might use a fruit picker that you find at the hardware store to collect the cones. Moral ecology views ecological relations through a moral lens. It investigates human activity for the moral values that shape beliefs and human action. Most importantly, moral ecologies are highly specific, being oriented towards a specific ecological and anthropological context. Anthropologist Caterina Scaramelli describes moral ecology as forms of ecological practice and thought in which morality, the concern for what is of value in life, is at stake. The shifting range of pinyon trees upsets a moral order built around a perceived static environment where spaces are clearly delineated between what should be forest and what should be shrubland, what should be the home of sage grouse and what should be the home of pinyon trees. This is part of what is being contested by Paiute moral ecologies of the forest. And here in the photo is just illustrating, one of the major threats to pinyon forests, and that's drought-induced mortality. The Southwest, especially in Arizona and New Mexico, saw a massive die-off a couple of decades ago, and this is a major concern for the Great Basin in the years ahead under climate change. These woodlands are not valued as timberland in the industrial economy. Their value is fixed as rangeland. Most of these landscapes are being used for livestock grazing. Only later did you see this shift in value towards the ecological value of species of concern, the sage grouse. This really has only happened in the last 20, 30 years or so. Numu systems of value challenge these presuppositions by seeing a relational moral ecology rather than a zero-sum relationship. Federal land management is premised on moral ecologies tied to notions of productivity, the productive capacity of the land to produce livestock for market or produce threatened species to secure their existence for the future. Something that's been more invisible to management has been moral relations and value of pine nut trees as part of people caring for plants and plants providing for people. So sometimes what happens is the land management is done at exclusion, or at least the diminishment of other modes of valuing life across a complex web of relations. And so I want to show you a quick video here. This is one method of tree removal that is employed in the Southwest. I'll be clear that this mode of removal is not happening in California. This video is coming from Utah. It is used in other parts of Nevada. So here, let's listen in and watch this for a moment. The root causes of changing forests are linked to changing land management. This includes the reestablishment of forests following widespread deforestation for mining and livestock grazing. A lot of that happened in the last several decades of the 19th century. But it also represents this changing range of the trees and density and so forth, adaptation. These changes are frequently cast as unnatural, but trees respond naturally to these forms of disturbance. At stake are questions about how we value the natural world and what it means to care for landscapes in this context, in the context of a changing environment. Moral values make a moral ecology. The response of indigenous communities to the devaluation of pinyon trees underscores their critique of Euro-American morals in the forest. To say that a tree belongs in one place but not another is a statement about what the world ought to look like, and descriptions of change itself cannot fully answer what should be done. Paiute theory of value that I'm sharing here is grounded in moral relationship where cultural practices are critical to sustaining the well-being of people and plants. Examples of this are sharing stories, which often very commonly involve pine nuts and offer moral guidance on human action, caring for the trees. So that might be tending through limbing the trees, removing the lower limbs. Burning was also a common practice, and then collecting pine nuts as well. This work that sustains the plants, both food, a source of identity, and a future claim to the place of indigenous peoples on their own lands is really important. Pine nut trees are cared for in a way that protects them from fire, for example, enables their life, but also leaves food for the other creatures that depend on them in the forest. Humans and other animals play a role in distributing seeds, thus growing the forest. This model of reciprocal relations is the moral ecology of the forest. And I should have mentioned, but earlier I had some photos up of some of those common seed dispersers. And because the seeds of pinyon are not winged, they depend upon people and animals for dispersing the seed that basically grows into the future forest. As Thomas once said to me in response to claims that trees shouldn't be growing in alluvial soils, he says, quote, "These trees aren't invading, they're doing what they're designed to do," unquote. Normative claims are central to human-environment relationships. They form the heart of political tension over the management of woodlands. But these values can sometimes be obscured in a scientific and management discourse that frames the changing distribution of forests through moralized language, such as encroachment. The changing environment poses fundamental sociocultural questions about what belongs and what does not on dynamic landscapes. Nature is not static, and its perturbations are constant. But beyond empirical arguments of physical changes in Earth systems is the variation in human interpretations of change, its meaning and material consequences for social identities and cultural practices. Missing from debates about how land should be managed is this moral ecology of the landscape. Numu practices of caring for forests reflects an ethos of mutual obligation among humans, plants, animals, and landscapes. It offers an alternative mode of valuing the environment in contrast to economic and physical modes of valuation, traditionally, but not always, prioritized by land management agencies and scientists. Rethinking the value of forests with moral worlds in mind collapses the deeply held division and conservation between people and nature. Sustaining these important relationships between people, place, and landscape is a fundamental challenge to rethink our place in nature in a time of the Anthropocene. So with that, at the end of my presentation, I wanted to thank the many institutions that have supported my research. This also includes local partners who participated in this research project, including the Bridgeport Indian Colony, the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, and the U.S. Forest Service. So please feel free to reach out to me by email. Thank you for listening. I look forward to questions and comments from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. We did have one first question from the audience from Teresa. She said, could you repeat the definition of moral ecology?
Sorry, you say it one more time. Oh, you want to know the author who's being cited? Well, there are a lot of people who've worked on moral ecology. I quoted Caterina Scaramelli, who is an anthropologist, and she has a book that came out not too long ago with Stanford University Press on the moral ecology of a wetland. It's based in Turkey. I found her thinking about this to be very insightful and would definitely recommend her book.
Great. And then there's a question that came in from Robert that says, are there programs to replant?
Yes, that's a great question. Some of the most innovative and I would say inspiring work is actually being led by the Washoe Tribe. They have lost a lot of pine nut trees on their lands, and they've actually been going out and doing replanting. There is some precedent for the federal agencies to do it, but it hasn't been very common. I think attitudes about that are changing. And so the Tamarack fire, which I mentioned during the presentation, is a good example of this. The Forest Service is really interested in doing replanting, reforestation with pinyon trees. A lot of fire burned not just on Forest Service land, but also on Washoe land. So that's a good partnership, and I think is going to set a precedent for thinking about what post-fire restoration looks like with planting trees. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that in the future.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that. Do you know any or like what the drivers were for the Forest Service being interested in replanting programs after that? Because it seems like the way you were talking about it, that might be a departure from what their policies were in the past.
Yes, I think that, well, so one of the things I've observed on the ground working with both agencies and tribal nations is that particularly in the last 2 years in the wake of the racial justice organizing that people were doing, there's been a lot more attention to engaging with Native nations. I think there's a lot more outreach on the part of agencies. It's been really significant that Deb Haaland is the Interior Secretary. There's been a lot of secretarial orders going down to different agencies, not just the Forest Service and the Department of Agriculture, but also the Department of the Interior agencies, that is laying out a much more robust framework for engaging with tribes in the consultation process, where tribes are involved in projects and given a chance to speak to them, but also looking at models of co-stewardship, where tribes can take a substantial role in managing lands off reservation. And this is really important in the Great Basin, just because the land dispossession has been near total. Most of the Paiute nations have just a very tiny land base relative to their ancestral homelands, the lands that that they occupied before they were dispossessed. And so having these kind of co-stewardship arrangements is a really effective way for tribes to play a role in managing forests, because they don't have forests on their own lands to manage. So there's some good movement in that direction. But I think broadly, there's a culture change happening in society that is, I think, recognizing the role of colonialism and creating a lot of these issues and trying to do a better job of engaging with tribal nations.
Great, thank you. And I have a question that came in from Jocelyn here. She says, thank you for this wonderful presentation. When I lived in northern New Mexico, Hispanics, Hispanic people also harvested pinon, also in a way that was integrated into family and ritual. Have you worked with any of those communities in your area, and have the tribal nations also created coalitions, and what, if any, tensions or coalitions do you see, and how might other communities ally with tribes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't worked with other communities beyond the three that I listed. I do know there's a long history of other, like, Euro-Americans in Nevada collecting pine nuts. I know I have neighbors that that would go out and do pine nut collecting every year. It seems a lot less common among non-Indigenous community members than perhaps it used to be a few decades ago. It would certainly be a really interesting thing to look at. It's not just Native communities that have a connection to the tree, and that is very relevant. In terms of allyship, the environmental groups have gotten better in the last couple of years at working with Native nations. Especially during the post-war period, when a lot of the pinyon cutting was going on, a lot of the environmental groups really stood aside and didn't take a big, strong position on it. But that's starting to change, which I do see as being a positive development. I think there's been more successful examples of what we might think of as unlikely alliances over other issues in the Great Basin, particularly opposition to mining. There's been a lot of collaboration. Often you see Native nations and ranchers working together in those cases. So great question. And definitely, certainly, New Mexico and Arizona is a different context for thinking about pinyon. I say pinyon, which is how people say it here in Nevada, but certainly pinyon would be the more common way of saying it in a lot of other places. And I haven't done a trip down there really to dig into this yet, but certainly look forward to doing that. So thanks for that question.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We had some questions about the pinyon trees. Specifically, one guest asks, are the pinyon edible like Korean varieties? And another person asked, when do trees begin producing via cones if started from seedlings?
Good questions. Yes, the seeds are edible and they taste delicious. They're unlike what you generally find in the supermarket, which is, I think, about 80% imported, mostly from Asia. It's actually quite hard to find local pine nuts out here, although you'll often see them at local markets in the fall. There's some commercial harvesting in certain places, although where I work in California, they don't do commercial harvesting, but anybody can go out and collect a certain, poundage of pine nuts. In terms of cone production, it really depends. It really depends. I used to hear people sort of say it takes 75 years for cones to produce, but I've definitely seen cones on much younger trees. But you have to imagine, you're going out to collect the cones. You want to go out to a place where there are lots of cones, where the trees are masting, and so you see a lot of variability in the production on particular trees, but also across different stands of trees. And so you might be in a stand that there'll be a couple pine cones on each tree or every few trees. That's a lot of work to go collect. Ideally you want to be in a place where there's like a the picture I showed you, there's just a ton of cones on the trees. And this masting cycle is believed to be linked to climate change. So in terms of planting and what that means for collecting. Yeah, if you're thinking about masting trees that produce a lot of cones, that takes a very, very long time. And this is something I hear my Indigenous colleagues comment on a lot. Like all the work that they're doing on doing reforestation really is thinking ahead, generations ahead. These are people who've grown up, parents and grandparents and other family members, taught them the practice of collecting pine nuts and how important the trees are. And that's something that people are imparting to future generations. And so people are thinking, in a couple hundred years, like, what do we need to do to ensure, that people in a community can still go out and do this really important cultural practice.
Great. Thank you so much. So there are a couple of different questions in the Q&A. One asks another question about the pinyon trees. It says, Robert asked, do the roots need a lot of groundwater?
Yeah, I mean, that's the principal way that they bring in water. And I have some colleagues who've done really interesting work, growing plants from seedlings and doing a common garden experiment. And one of the things I was really amazed by is that it has a really long taproot that it shoots down really, really fast. So even in the seedlings that are just a year old, you'll see the taproot going this deep. And so that deep taproot is how the tree is able to get down and get access to water. There are different types of pinyon in the Great Basin. As I mentioned, there's more of this cycle of snowfall in the mountains, and the pinyon range does have a certain correspondence with where you get this winter snowpack that persists for a little while. So that's really important that the snow falls and then it will slowly melt, and so that's an important source of water. And the tree will actually shut down during the dry months, as basically an adaptation to being in a really arid environment. And this is one thing that's really incredible about the trees. They're so well adapted to growing in these arid landscapes. So when you're thinking about climate change, there are a few trees that are as capable as pinyon trees and adapting to changing environmental conditions. But obviously there are limits to that, and that's where you're seeing some of the die-off happening.
Okay. And then there is a comment from another audience member. They asked, does cattle grazing help certain plant varieties such as grasses from trampling or grazing, and would limiting the number of livestock based on moral ecology assist native nations and the forest?
So there's not a lot of livestock grazing that happens in the really dense forest, because when the trees grow close together, it really precludes the development of understory plants, forbs, grasses, shrubs, and so forth. But you will see grazing happening where the woodlands are more open. And there's been a lot of work done on grazing impacts. I personally don't see like a big impact on pinyon trees by the grazing itself, in the sense that the pinyon trees, they don't grow out in the open. They require some kind of nurse plant or even sort of nurse structure to grow under, so they can be a little bit protected. So they're often, you'll find them growing under sagebrush plants. This is an interesting association. Or next to a rock, and so they often end up in places that are less likely to be trampled. I actually think it's the understory that often can be negatively impacted by livestock grazing. And I think this is one of the big tensions in sage grouse conservation, is what role grazing plays in helping or hurting sage grouse. And for folks that work in ranching, the feeling is that there's they don't harm each other, that the sage grouse, will use the watered areas that the cows use. And then there are other people who push back on that and argue that the grazing is negatively impacting the plant species that sage grouse depend on. So the grazing issue is very significant. It's very politically contentious, since it is a major industry, especially in Nevada, and people have a lot of roots in this work. And I think there's been a lot of engagement between the agencies and ranchers on the issue of sage grouse, but up until recently, there's a lot less involvement of tribal nations, and so I think there really is a need to kind of bring everyone together and talking about this. And there's some collaborative conservation working groups that are trying to do this.
Okay. And I wanted to ask one question about this. So I was wondering if you know of other places or other systems where there is this sort of moral ecology between humans and non-human species. Is this kind of a unique feature in your ecosystem, or do you know of other places or other communities that have a similar type of relationship with the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think local communities that, you know, whose you know, lifeways and livelihoods are tied to plants, develop these important connections all over the world, but it looks different depending on where you are. You know, what I was trying to sketch out really was a moral ecology that spoke to this particular place and the people that call this place home. But certainly there are other scholars who've written about moral ecology and think about it in other contexts. So I think I don't think it's unusual by any means, but obviously it's going to look, that moral ecology will vary depending on the context that you're talking about. And so in that sense, I feel like, you know, what I'm speaking to really is the Great Basin, you know, this part of the Great Basin. I think there are certain things that you can generalize from that experience. You're thinking about people-plant relations that are valuable in a broader context, but a lot of the specifics, you know, have to do with certain plants and that relationship over very long periods of time. When, you know, the methods of caring for certain plants are going to be particular. You know, even with pinyon trees, there are different practices for caring for the trees in different places. It's not the same everywhere. So even in the Southwest, there's variation. So it's a good question. I see it as being broadly applicable across the world, but within different contexts.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting too. I think a lot of this type of work focuses on like food products or, you know, products that are used for medicine or something like that. But I've even seen in my own work, people have a relationship with trees or plant species that don't necessarily provide them something, but it's sort of a more intangible connection. But like you said, it's so specific to the communities that you're in and who you speak to in those communities that it's really important to do that place specific work in order to get at those particularities. We do have another question here. I think this is going to be our last one because we're almost out of time, but this one is from Andis, and he says, given that Native tribes are a collection of individuals with different perspectives, in your ethnographic interviews, did you encounter diverging opinions from perhaps a dominant narrative?
Yeah, I mean, definitely this is part of the value of ethnography is trying to uncover the complexity of these issues, and any given community, there are a lot of different views that people hold. And so, you know, I did a lot of interviews across the community, and that's the empirical basis for me making a kind of general claim about what the preponderance of people think. But even within that, there's variation, you know. I think it is very widely, this connection to pinyon trees is very, very widely held in the community. But some people are more engaged in the politics of the issue than others. Some other people are much more disengaged, and people have different interpretations of what should be done on the land as well. So I think that's a totally fair point, that there is variation within any group of people, and that goes the same for ranchers or for, you know, folks that work for the management federal, you know, lands agencies. You know, nobody thinks, that's not that everyone thinks exactly the same thing, but I do think by doing the ethnographic work over a period of years and being really deeply enmeshed and talking to a lot of people, you're basically able to elucidate some general sense of where people fall on that. But in the actual like writing of my dissertation, of course, I try and mix in some of the different views to give a little bit more sense of the diversity there that that I've kind of glossed over a little bit in the presentation for lack of time, but it's a point well taken.
Sure, of course. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very rich discussion that we've been able to have today. I found it very exciting, again, as a plant ecologist and someone who's studying a bit about like the push and pull between productivity and the valuation of leaving land alone or traditionally managed land. I thought this was a really fascinating talk. So thank you so much, Paul, for that.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining.
I'm just going to say a couple of quick announcements before we leave today. Please do follow us on social media, or if you would like to stay in touch with us and learn about some of the other talks that are upcoming through the Peabody, you can sign up for our mailing list at the bottom of the Peabody website. We'd like to make sure that you know about all of our upcoming online programs. And we do have a few other talks coming up in this series soon, so please keep an eye out for any materials on those as they come out. Our next speaker will be Sophie Westicott, who's from the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and she'll be giving her talk on April 28th. But in the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful April, and thanks again to Paul for a wonderful presentation, and thanks again to everyone in the audience for showing up today and taking part in this talk.